He told her to pack her things, right there in front of the twins. His voice was loud, final, the kind of final that comes from a man who's buried his wife and never healed after. But just as she turned to leave, a small voice broke through the silence. "Don't send her away." Then another, "Please, Daddy. She makes it feel warm again." And in that moment, the man who thought nothing could touch him stood absolutely still. Because the sons who hadn't spoken in weeks just did. And it wasn't just what they said, it was how they said it, like they were remembering something he'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Richard James didn't believe in miracles. Not anymore. His wife, Claire, was the miracle. And when cancer took her, he locked every soft thing in a box and buried it beside her, including himself. Since then, his mansion became a place of order, not love. Of rules, not grace. Of silence, not laughter. His sons hadn't smiled since the funeral. They hadn't spoken in over a month. And Richard, he convinced himself that emotions were weakness, that pain should be kept behind doors, that if he could control everything, then nothing would ever hurt again. And then she showed up, Stella Gray, a quiet woman with soft eyes and a habit of humming hymns while folding laundry. He didn't like her. He didn't trust softness. He certainly didn't trust the way his sons looked at her, like they remembered what safety felt like. So when he came home that Thursday afternoon and found her kneeling on the floor with both boys wrapped around her, he snapped. His voice filled the marble hallway. "What is this? What did I tell you about boundaries?" She stood slowly, one twin still holding her leg. "Sir, you're done here." His tone left no room for discussion. "Pack your things. I want you out by the hour." She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She just looked at him gently as if she saw through all the noise. And then God moved, not with thunder, not with fire, but with a whisper that came from Freddie, age 5. He looked up at his father, his voice, small, trembling, alive. "Don't send her away." Richard froze. Freddie hadn't spoken in 37 days. Before he could react, Oliver stepped forward, gripping his sleeve. "She makes it feel warm again, Daddy." That's when something inside Richard cracked, not all the way, but enough. Enough for him to stop yelling, enough for him to feel the sting of tears he swore he'd never cry again. The hallway was silent now, not cold, just still. The kind of still where God speaks. Stella didn't say anything at first. She just knelt, resting a hand on each boy's shoulder, a quiet prayer echoing in her spirit. "Lord, don't let this man push them further into silence. Let him see. Let him remember." And Richard, he didn't know why his knees felt weak, or why his dead wife's voice came to him just then. A memory. "You don't have to do this alone, Rich. Let them be held." It was too much. He turned, left the hallway without another word. But something had changed, and Stella knew. Not because he softened, but because he didn't slam the door. Sometimes God doesn't fix the storm. He just sends someone who doesn't leave. If this moment touched you, click subscribe, like this video, and let us know where you're watching from. I pray this story reminds you, sometimes God sends healing in the form of a person who simply stays. The hallway was still quiet when Stella zipped up her small suitcase. She'd folded her uniform carefully, as if doing so gently might ease the ache in her chest. She wasn't surprised by the outcome. She had seen this kind of pain before. Grief that builds walls so tall, even love can't climb them without permission. But still, she had hoped. She sat on the edge of the guest bed, hands resting in her lap, heart steady but heavy. Sometimes obedience doesn't look like staying. Sometimes it looks like walking away when God hasn't made the next step clear. She closed her eyes, whispered under her breath, "If you sent me here for only that moment, I trust you. But if there's more, Lord, I make it plain I won't force my way into anyone's healing." Then, a knock. Soft, hesitant, not from authority, from small fingers and courage. She opened the door, expecting silence. Instead, she found Oliver. His cheeks were flushed from crying. In his hand, a drawing, a stick-figure family, 2 little boys, 1 tall man, and 1 woman. In the middle, she stood holding hands with them. No words, just that. He looked up at her, lips trembling. She didn't say anything, just knelt beside him. And in the quiet, her eyes stung, not from sadness, but from knowing. This boy, this silent, closed-off, broken-hearted boy, had chosen her. The next morning came slower than usual. The sun rose, but the house remained dim, as if unsure it was allowed to be warm again. Stella stood in the kitchen, not in uniform this time. No apron, no instructions, no clarity. Just waiting. She wasn't sure if she'd already been replaced. But she stayed. Sometimes, waiting is obedience too. A soft clatter echoed behind her. 2 chairs slid across the kitchen floor. The twins, climbing into their seats, waiting quietly for breakfast like they always did, except now they were watching her. Freddie spoke first. A whisper, barely there. "Pancakes?" She turned slowly. "You remember I made pancakes?" He nodded. Stella blinked back the sudden sting in her chest. Then pancakes it is. She didn't need permission. She needed purpose. And right now, their hunger felt holy. The batter sizzled. Butter melted on the skillet. The boys sat still, but their eyes followed her every move. Halfway through flipping the first stack, she heard footsteps again. This time, slower, measured. Richard James entered the room. His suit was crisp, but his eyes weren't sharp this morning. They looked like a man who hadn't slept, like a man who had listened to the silence and found it heavier than he could carry. He didn't speak, didn't order, didn't even ask why she was still here. Just watched. And for the first time since Claire died, he saw his sons giggle at pancake bubbles, saw Oliver reach across the table to poke his brother's cheek, saw Freddie whisper something only Stella heard, and saw her smile back with eyes that knew children better than any manual ever could. He leaned against the doorframe and said nothing. But inside, something was breaking, not like glass, more like ground thawing after a long winter. Later that morning, Stella stepped outside to catch her breath, not because she was tired, but because too much good after too much grief feels like holding your breath underwater. She leaned against the back wall of the house, her eyes closed toward the sky. "If you're doing something, Lord, keep me soft. Let me be what they need, even if I never get credit for it." When she turned back toward the house, Richard was standing behind the glass, watching. Not glaring, not angry, just watching. Like he didn't know what to do with a moment that didn't ask him to lead it. By evening, the house had shifted. Not loud, not bright, but different. A napkin left unfolded, a toy left on the couch, and laughter just once from upstairs. Stella didn't know what the next day would hold, whether she'd be allowed to stay or if this was just a borrowed moment. But she did know this. Something had opened. And when God opens something, no man can close it. She walked past the study late that night. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Richard sat at his desk staring at an old photo. Claire, holding the boys, her arms wide, her smile wide, her eyes bright with something this house had forgotten. Joy. He didn't notice Stella passing, but she saw him. Saw the way he gripped the frame like it was keeping him alive. Saw the way his shoulders sagged just slightly, as if he was finally letting grief fall where it belonged. On the ground. At God's feet. The next morning came quietly. No raised voices, no instructions, no permission either. Just Stella in the kitchen, humming as she poured pancake batter into a warmed skillet, and 2 little boys with tousled blonde hair sitting at the table, waiting like they had always belonged to the moment. It was only her 5th day at the estate, but something in the air already felt different, not healed, but softer. She wasn't wearing the uniform today. It felt wrong, too pressed, too distant, so she wore a pale blue blouse and jeans, simple and clean. Nothing fancy. But she'd always believed warmth didn't come from clothes anyway. It came from presence. The boys seemed lighter. Freddie was tapping the spoon against his glass, not to annoy, just to hear the sound. Oliver giggled when she flipped a pancake too high and had to catch it with a plate. There was a looseness to them now. Not loud, but alive. She almost forgot this wasn't hers to keep, until he walked in. Richard James entered the kitchen with the tension of a man still wearing grief like armor. His jaw was tight, his sleeves perfectly rolled, not a hair out of place. But his eyes didn't match the rest of him today. They looked like someone who hadn't decided who he needed to be yet. He stood in the doorway longer than necessary, long enough for Freddie to notice, long enough for Oliver to turn in his seat and go still. The joy in the room slipped into hiding. The boys didn't move, didn't speak. They just stared at their father like they were waiting for permission to exist again. Stella stayed by the stove, calm, but alert. She could feel it coming, the command. Richard cleared his throat. "Miss Gray." His voice was formal, cold. "We need to talk." She turned, gently, met his eyes, didn't flinch. "Yes, sir." "Not here." The boys looked between them. Stella gave a quiet smile to the boys. "Finish your breakfast. I'll be right back." Freddie nodded slowly, eyes wide. Oliver's lips pressed into a tight line, but he stayed seated. That was new. A week ago they would have followed her like shadows. Now, they trusted her promise. The study door clicked shut behind them. Books lined the walls. Everything was sharp and dark, mahogany wood, leather chairs, spotless floors, like a room built for control. Richard stood behind his desk, fingers clenched around the back of his chair. Stella stood across from him, hands folded in front of her. Still, respectful, but not afraid. He let silence hang for a moment too long, then spoke. "You were hired to clean, not to play, not to counsel, not to interfere." Stella held his gaze. "I understand." He paced once behind the chair. His voice dropped lower. "You were told the boys need structure, boundaries, professional supervision." Stella spoke gently. "And in that structure they stopped speaking." He froze, not because he didn't know it, but because hearing it out loud sounded like failure. She continued, voice soft as cloth. "I didn't touch them first, they came to me. I didn't ask them to speak, but when they did..." Her eyes flickered with emotion, but her tone stayed steady. "I knew better than to silence it." Richard looked at her then, truly looked, not like an employee, like a person who had seen something he hadn't, and that made him angry, not at her, at everything, at the fact that it wasn't supposed to be her. Not some woman from a cleaning agency with a quiet voice and no degree in child psychology. Not someone humming hymns while folding towels. "Why you?" he said quietly, more to himself than her. Stella didn't answer right away. She just let the question sit in the room, because she'd asked herself the same thing, every night. Then she stepped forward, not closer, just clearer. "Because I've known loss, Mr. James. I've seen what it does when it hardens people, and I've seen what happens when someone stays long enough to soften it again." He looked away then, swallowed hard. She didn't push, didn't try to fix him. She just stood still, like a presence that didn't demand anything. Sometimes that's all grief needs. Not words, not action. Just someone who doesn't leave when it gets heavy. He finally spoke again. "I haven't heard them laugh in months." It wasn't a confession, but it wasn't denial either. She nodded gently. "They're not healed, but they're reaching." His gaze met hers once more. "Don't make promises you can't keep." Her reply was soft, almost like prayer. "I won't. But I'll keep showing up." He didn't answer, just sat down at his desk rubbing his temples. The conversation was over, not resolved, but open, and for now, that was enough. Stella stepped back into the hallway. The boys were still at the table, Crayon drawings spread between them. Freddie looked up, worry flickering in his eyes. Stella gave the smallest nod, a quiet yes. She was still here. And somewhere in the study behind her, a man who thought God had left his house sat with his head in his hands, wondering why the silence felt different today. That night the wind was heavy across the hill. Branches tapped the windows, the kind of restless tapping that made the house feel uneasy, like it too remembered something it didn't want to feel. Stella stood by the guest room window, arms wrapped loosely around her waist, eyes on the darkness outside. She hadn't unpacked. Her bag still sat on the bench, half zipped, half ready. She never stayed too long in any house. Sometimes grief didn't push you out, it simply never invited you in. Down the hall, laughter, soft and sleepy, drifted from the boys' room. A storybook, some giggles, a whispered, "Good night." It should have been comforting, but instead it pressed against something buried inside her. She blinked slowly. Her hands tightened. Then she walked over to the bag and pulled out a small, battered photo. Edges worn, folded once down the middle. A boy, maybe 10 years old. Freckles, a smile too wide for his face. Her little brother, Joshua. She sat on the bed, turning the photo over, a scribbled verse in faint blue ink. Even if he doesn't, he is still good. Daniel, 3:18. Her thumb brushed the edge of the page. That verse had been taped to his hospital bed. She'd written it, but after the fire, after the smoke, the screaming, the split-second choice to grab the baby next door first, she stopped believing it, stopped teaching, stopped singing, stopped letting herself be close to anyone who might reach for her and not survive. A soft knock pulled her back. Not loud, just one knock. Then the door creaked open. It was Oliver, in pajama pants too long and a mismatched shirt, hair sticking up on one side like he'd fallen asleep and woken up just to come find her. In his hand, a drawing. Another one. This one had 3 figures, 2 boys, 1 woman. No man this time, just the 3 of them under a sun that looked more like a heart. He walked over and held it out. She took it slowly. "You made this tonight?" He nodded. Then, for the first time, spoke with quiet certainty. "Freddie said you don't leave." Her breath caught. Not because the words were dramatic, but because they were true. He climbed up beside her without asking, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And when he leaned his head against her arm, she whispered into the silence, "I lost someone too." His fingers stilled against the fabric of her shirt. "My brother, a long time ago. He was small, kind. He loved building things out of cardboard." She smiled faintly. "After he died, I stopped building anything at all." Oliver didn't speak, but he didn't leave either. His presence gave her permission to continue. "I was a teacher once, but grief made me question if I could protect anyone again. So I cleaned instead. It was easier to scrub away other people's messes than face the mess inside myself." She exhaled, voice low. "But God kept placing children in my path. One here, one there, and then you two." Oliver looked up at her. "God sent you?" The question was so innocent, so raw, it nearly undid her. She could have brushed it off, could have smiled and nodded like adults do when the truth hurts too much, but she didn't. She looked him in the eyes. "I think God sent you to remind me not to run anymore." Oliver's lower lip trembled, but he smiled. Not wide, not bright, but real. Later, when he'd fallen asleep beside her, she carried him gently back to his room. Freddie stirred when she laid his brother down, opened his eyes, reached for her hand. She took it without hesitation, held it longer than necessary, and in that quiet, something lifted from the room. Not the pain, not the past, but the weight of walking through it alone. She walked back to her room, her feet light, but her heart full. God hadn't healed her wound, but he was using it. Not through grand gestures, but through 2 little boys who drew pictures with hearts for sons. Down the hallway a door creaked. Richard, standing in the shadows, watching. He hadn't said a word all night, but his sons had laughed, and the woman he tried to fire had held both their hearts in her hands, without asking for anything in return. He turned back toward his study, pulled open a drawer he hadn't touched in months. Inside, a letter, still sealed, Claire's handwriting on the front. He stared at it, but didn't open it. Not yet. The morning light didn't touch the house the same way it had the day before. It filtered in slower, as if uncertain, stretching long shadows across the walls and settling in corners that still remembered grief. Stella stood in the linen hallway, folding warm towels from the dryer, her hands moving on instinct. Her mind elsewhere. Last night hadn't left her. The drawing. The boy curled against her shoulder. The memory of her brother's name whispered in the quiet of her room. Some things stay in the skin long after they leave the air. Across the corridor, the boys were building something with blocks. Stella could hear the soft clatter, the kind that sounded more like restoration than play. They were healing, not because she taught them, but because they felt safe. And yet, she didn't feel settled. Richard hadn't spoken to her since the conversation in the study. Not a word, not a glance. Just silence where suspicion used to be. But silence had weight, and this one felt heavier than before. She walked past the main hall, her steps light. A family portrait hung by the staircase. Claire smiling, her arms around the boys, Richard behind them, distant even in the frame. It was the only photo in the house with her face on it. Stella paused there. Claire didn't look fragile. She looked bright, present, like she was the warmth this place was trying to remember. She moved on without touching it. The boys had asked her to help them find their lost puzzle pieces, said they were hidden in the closet by the soft stuff. She assumed they meant blankets, but when she opened the linen closet by the end of the west wing, something caught her eye. A small cardboard box, tucked behind folded quilts and labeled only with a name. Claire. No last name. She stood frozen just for a moment. Not from fear but reverence, she could feel it. This wasn't clutter, it was sacred. She reached for it gently, holding it as if it might break or breathe. She brought it to the sitting room, where light filtered through the lace curtains just enough to make the dust shimmer. She sat on the floor, cross-legged, the box between her knees. She didn't open it, not at first. She closed her eyes, whispered a prayer with no language. Just surrender. Then she lifted the lid. Inside, a stack of drawings, clearly the boys', with their shaky handwriting and bold, chaotic color. One said, "Mommy's hair in the wind." Another, "Mommy in heaven but still watching." Beneath them, a collection of small audio tapes, labeled in pen. For the hard days, if they ever forget how to laugh. To Richard, when you feel far away. And then, at the very bottom, a letter, sealed, his name written in blue ink. For Richard, open when silence feels safer than love. Stella's hand trembled. She didn't open it. It wasn't hers. She just stared at the envelope, realizing it had been there all along. Unopened, unheard. And suddenly, she wasn't angry at him. She just felt sad. Because sometimes grief doesn't forget, it buries. She heard footsteps behind her, not fast, but deliberate. She turned, the box still in her lap. Richard stood there, one hand in his pocket, the other hanging awkwardly by his side. His eyes didn't go to her. They went to the box, and for the first time, something in his face changed. Not rage, not confusion, recognition. He exhaled, a small, sharp breath, as if his own name startled him. Stella didn't move. She didn't explain. She simply held the box out, arms extended, like someone offering back a memory that never belonged to her. Richard stared at it, then stepped forward, slowly. He knelt. Not beside her, not close, just low enough to feel the weight of what he'd ignored. He reached for the letter, paused, then let his hand fall. "I can't." It was barely a whisper. Stella nodded. "I know." His voice cracked. She used to record things. After the boys went to sleep, she said love leaves a trail, even if no one's following it yet. Stella watched him, the way his shoulders slumped, the way his voice softened as if speaking to someone long gone, or maybe still here. "She left this trail for you," she said gently. "And for them." He didn't reply, but he took the box from her hands, cradled it like something living, and stood. The moment didn't close anything, but something opened, not between them, inside him. That night, the boys asked if they could listen to a mommy tape, said they remembered the sound of her voice, but just barely. Richard stood in the doorway as Stella placed the first tape into the old recorder. Claire's voice filled the room, soft, strong, familiar. "If you forget how to love, let the boys remind you. If the house gets too quiet, bring someone in who knows how to listen between the silences." Stella didn't look at Richard, but she could feel it. The shaking breath he let out, the way his hand curled against the doorframe. She closed her eyes, not to escape the moment, but to let it land. Sometimes God speaks not through thunder, but through a voice left behind on tape. It started with laughter, not loud, not wild. Just a giggle, soft and surprised, in the middle of a Tuesday breakfast. Freddie spilled a spoonful of syrup on his pajama shirt, and Oliver made a face like it was the end of the world. Then they both laughed. Real laughter. The kind that comes from a place not even they knew was waking up. Stella froze for a second, spatula in hand, mid-flip. She didn't speak, didn't draw attention to it. She just let it live. Because joy, especially fragile joy, should never feel interrupted. Across the kitchen, Richard stood behind the morning paper, still, silent, but not unreadable. His eyes had lifted when the boys laughed, and for a breath or two, they stayed lifted. But then he looked back down. The days began to shift in small ways. The boys started speaking more, not in long sentences, but in patterns, in questions, in giggles that echoed into rooms that hadn't heard childhood in months. They began leaving their toys in the living room, their socks on the stairs. They fought over which pancakes were crispier. They asked for seconds. And in the middle of it all was Stella, humming softly under her breath, always listening, always near. The house felt warmer, not by temperature, but by presence. It wasn't perfect. Grief still hung in corners. Claire's absence still hovered in every room, but something had changed. This house was breathing again. That afternoon, Stella sat in the garden just beyond the kitchen, sorting through a basket of the boys' outgrown clothes for donation. The air smelled like soil and rosemary. A breeze pushed through the hydrangeas. She wasn't sure how long she'd been sitting there when Richard stepped out. No jacket, no phone, no clipboard, just him. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there watching her fold a tiny shirt with sailboats on it. "I bought that for Freddie when we took them to the lake," he said quietly. Claire said it made him look like a storybook sailor. Stella smiled but didn't look up. "Fits him." A pause, then, "You stayed," he said. She lifted her gaze slowly, met his eyes. "Yes," she replied. "I didn't know if I should, but I felt led." He sat down on the edge of the bench, hands resting on his knees. "I don't understand why this hurts more now than it did before." His voice wasn't defensive. It was honest, worn. Stella set the basket aside. "Because before, you kept everything numb," she said. "And now, the feeling is coming back." Richard ran a hand through his hair. She made it all look easy. The parenting, the laughter, the way she gave. "I never learned how to do that without her." "You don't have to do it perfectly," Stella said. "You just have to show up." A moment passed, then another. The wind picked up again, rustling the pages of a book left open on the garden table. He looked toward the sound, then back at her. "Do you believe God and puts people in our lives like this?" he asked. Stella didn't answer right away. "I believe God doesn't waste pain," she said slowly. "And I believe he sends help, sometimes through people we never saw coming." Richard's jaw clenched, but not with anger, with restraint. He looked down at his hands. I've spent months trying to control everything. The schedule, the boys, the silence. Because the truth is, I didn't want anyone to see how badly I was breaking. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, fully, quietly. Some nights, I still wake up expecting her to be there, he said. I reach across the bed, and when I remember, it all floods back. His voice cracked. I thought I was keeping the boys safe by locking everything down. No music, no touch, no emotion. He shook his head. But I was really just trying not to feel. Stella's voice came like water. But they were still feeling, alone. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The only sound was the garden wind and the distant laugh of a boy chasing his brother. Then, something shifted. Richard looked up. Tears didn't fall, but his face was no longer guarded. There was pain there, but also humility. Something that said, I know I can't keep this house cold forever. That night, Stella didn't pray to stay. She just prayed that whatever God was doing, he'd keep doing it, even if it broke every rule this house once lived by. After the boys went to sleep, Richard stood alone in Claire's old study. The box was still there. The letter, unopened. He ran his fingers over the sealed edge, pressed his thumb beneath the flap, then stopped. Not tonight, but soon, very soon. And in the hallway just beyond, the hum of Stella's voice as she quietly picked up a scattered toy, like a lullaby not meant to be noticed, but still deeply felt. The storm rolled in just after midnight. No warning, no gentle breeze to announce its arrival, just thunder. Close, fast, unforgiving. The kind of storm that wakes a house in its bones. Rain pounded the windows like 100 fists. Wind curled around the estate like it wanted in. Stella was already up. Something had stirred her before the first crack of thunder. Not sound, but a feeling. A tension in the air. A whisper in her spirit. She slipped from bed barefoot and moved through the dark with quiet urgency. Not toward the hallway, but toward the boys' room. When she pushed the door open, she didn't hear crying. She heard silence. Too still, too tight. Then her eyes adjusted. Freddie sat up in bed, his fingers gripping the quilt. But it was Noah, curled against the headboard, shaking, who made her stop. He wasn't crying. He wasn't moving, just frozen. As thunder cracked again, Stella entered slowly, keeping her voice low. Hey, sweetheart. But Noah didn't look up. His hands were balled into fists, pressed against his mouth. Freddie watched, eyes wide and scared. He didn't know what to do. He only knew this wasn't normal. Stella knelt beside the bed. It's just a storm, baby. Just the sky being loud. Noah flinched. His chest rose and fell too fast. Breath caught halfway between inhale and panic. And Stella knew then. This wasn't just about thunder. This was about memory. The kind that hides until lightning calls it back. The door burst open behind her. Richard. He looked half asleep, fully alarmed, his shirt clinging to one side and his hair undone. His eyes locked onto Noah. What happened? His voice was sharper than intended. Freddie shrank back in the bed. Noah didn't respond, still shaking, still silent. Richard stepped forward. I'll call Dr. Lang. He said if this happens, he needs presence. Stella interrupted softly. Richard stopped, his fists clenched. Presence doesn't stop panic. Stella looked up at him. No, but panic doesn't survive love. It wasn't a challenge. It was truth. She turned back to Noah, staying close, but not touching. Not yet. I'm here, she whispered. I'm not going anywhere. He rocked slightly, whispered something that sounded like Mom. It shattered something in Richard's posture. He dropped to one knee beside the bed. His voice cracked. Noah. The boy didn't respond. He was too far in, too deep. Stella reached behind her, grasped one of the boy's worn blankets, and gently laid it across his lap. Then she began humming. Soft, low, not to fix, but to steady. A song her mother once sang in the middle of hard nights. Not a lullaby. A prayer. Richard just stared, helpless, unarmed. This was the moment he had spent months trying to prevent. And now it was here, and all his defenses were useless. Noah's fists began to loosen, barely. But enough. His breathing slowed. One hand uncurled and reached out, not for Stella, for his father. Richard didn't move at first. Then slowly, he placed his hand beneath his son's. Noah gripped it, tight. And then, for the first time in weeks, he cried. Not from fear, from release. The room went quiet. The storm still screamed outside, but inside, something calmed. Stella stepped back. Let them have it. The moment, the breakthrough, the grace. Later, after the boys had fallen asleep, Noah still holding onto Richard's shirt, Stella found herself in the hallway outside their room. She leaned against the wall, hands trembling, not from fear, from awe. God had shown up. In the middle of thunder, he had answered a prayer too deep for words, and she had watched a father finally hold his son without hiding behind control. Richard stepped out not long after. He looked undone, and more human than he'd ever appeared. His voice was hoarse. I didn't know what to do. Stella met his eyes. You didn't have to know. You just had to stay. He nodded once, then, thank you. It wasn't enough, but it was honest. She didn't reply, just placed a gentle hand on his arm and gave the smallest nod. There would be more storms. But now, he knew how to weather one. Later that night, Richard sat alone in the boys' playroom, staring at a wooden block tower still standing from the afternoon. He picked up one of the blocks, held it in his palm, and wept, quietly, not because of what was lost, but because, for the first time, he believed healing might still be possible. The morning after the storm, the house held its breath. No voices, no rushing, only a quiet that felt reverent, the kind of silence that follows a sacred breaking. Richard sat alone in Claire's old study. The curtains were half drawn, letting in soft morning light that painted the room in gold and dust. On the desk in front of him, the box sat open, and next to it, the letter, still sealed, still waiting. He hadn't touched it yet. He didn't even reach for his coffee, didn't check his phone, didn't move. He just sat there, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes locked on a name written in blue ink. Claire. Not wife, not mother. Just Claire. The woman who once laughed in this room while folding baby clothes and humming to herself like she didn't know life could break. He missed her most in silence, not in anniversaries or milestones, but in mornings like this, when the boys were still asleep, and the only sound was the ache of her absence. He finally reached for the envelope. The paper felt thin, but it shook in his hands like it carried weight. He didn't open it right away. He held it to his chest for a moment, closed his eyes. God, if I'm going to read this, help me listen. And then, slowly, he tore the seal. The letter unfolded like it had been waiting years to breathe. Claire's handwriting, familiar, full of loops and kindness, spilled across the page in quiet strength. My love, she wrote, if you're reading this, it means the house has gone quiet. I always knew it might. You were never built for loss, Richard. You built walls for business, for negotiation, but not for grief. That kind of pain doesn't obey plans, it doesn't follow schedules. You tried to hold everything together. You did. But sometimes, holding too tight is what makes things fall apart. The boys don't need perfection. They need presence, laughter, mess, noise, and you. Let them feel, let them cry, let them be hugged until they fall asleep in your arms again. And if the house forgets how to breathe, bring someone in who knows how to listen between the silences. The last line stopped him. He read it twice, then a third time. His breath shuddered. He thought he'd done what was best, by keeping the house in order, by locking away anything soft. But he had misunderstood strength, and mistaken grief for failure. Stella's voice came back to him then, from the night before. You don't have to know what to do. You just have to stay. And he had. Not perfectly. Not gracefully. But he had stayed. The sound of feet padded softly in the hallway. Not rushed, just familiar. Richard folded the letter, pressed it against his chest, and turned. The door cracked open. Stella stood there, her hand resting on the frame. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. I read it, he said. Her expression softened. He stood slowly, walked toward her, the letter still in hand. For a moment, they simply stood in the quiet. Two people not trying to fix anything, just letting truth settle between them. Later that afternoon, Richard called a meeting with his board. He stood at the head of a long glass table in a room filled with polished ambition. But this time, he didn't speak from authority. He spoke from honesty. My sons need a father right now, not a CEO. Some of the men and women exchanged glances, but no one interrupted. He continued, effective immediately, I'm stepping back. Not to escape, but to show up. We've built towers that scrape the sky, but I've forgotten how to build a home. By evening, the house was still quiet, but not empty. The boys ran through the hallway chasing a balloon, laughing as it floated just out of reach. Stella was in the kitchen, humming over a pot of soup, the kind of tune you don't sing to be heard, just to keep peace near. And Richard. He stood by the living room window, watching his sons move with the kind of joy that once felt extinct. His fingers brushed the edge of Claire's letter, tucked inside his shirt pocket. He didn't smile, not fully, but something in his eyes broke open, like light through a sky long overcast. That night, he sat in the boys' room, not as a visitor, as their father. He told them a story. One Claire used to tell, about a lighthouse and a storm. Freddie rested his head on his shoulder. Noah clutched his hand, and when they fell asleep, Richard stayed, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to. And for the first time he whispered a prayer, not for success, not for control, just gratitude. Thank you for not leaving us in the silence. It was Stella who found it, tucked high in the attic, in a corner that hadn't been touched since Claire's last spring. The light came in through a dusty pane of glass, painting long beams across boxes labeled Christmas, Baby Toys, Claire. She had only meant to find a blanket. But instead, she found a trunk. Inside, music sheets, old letters and journals, and a red cloth tail spilling out from the edge of a folded object. A kite, worn, a little frayed, but beautiful, hand-painted with bluebirds in flight and Claire's handwriting on the tail. For the days when joy feels far. Later that afternoon, she showed it to the boys. Noah traced the birds with his fingertips. Freddie read the words softly, lips moving like a prayer. Neither of them had flown a kite before, but they knew what it was. And somehow, they knew it mattered. The hill behind the estate wasn't large, but it rose just enough to catch the wind. Stella walked up with the boys, while the late autumn sun sank gently into the earth behind them. Richard followed at a distance. He hadn't been on that hill since Claire died. It was where they used to sit, on Sunday afternoons, when the world was quiet and their boys were still small enough to carry. The grass crunched underfoot, and when they reached the top, the wind lifted suddenly, as if summoned. Stella knelt to tie the string around the boy's hands. "You hold it," she said, "but let the wind do the rest." They ran. At first the kite stumbled, lifted once, fell. Freddie looked discouraged, but Noah tugged the string tighter, held his breath, then ran again. This time, it caught. The red kite rose high above them, dancing against the deepening sky. It pulled and soared, tail fluttering like a memory made visible. Richard stopped walking, just watched. Watched his sons running, watched their laughter returning, watched Stella's face tilted upward, her smile soft and knowing. He felt something in his chest, not pain, but space, room. He walked the rest of the way, didn't speak, just stood beside them, eyes following the kite as it climbed higher. Freddie tugged his sleeve. "Mom made it." Richard looked down. "We found it in her trunk," Noah added. "She wanted us to fly it." There was no mistaking the hope in their voices, not the kind children fake, the kind that returns when sorrow begins to loosen its grip. He crouched beside them, took the string from Noah's hand for a moment, held it up toward the sky, let it pull, and whispered, so only they could hear, "She'd be proud of you." As the sun slipped below the tree line, the kite danced like a flame against the sky. Not a goodbye, a signal that something was still rising even after everything else had fallen. Later that night, Stella found Richard in the kitchen. He was pouring 2 mugs of tea. When he turned, he handed one to her. Didn't say much, just smiled, and slid an envelope across the counter. She opened it slowly. Inside, a formal offer. Child engagement specialist. Full-time. With a note handwritten at the bottom. "This house is breathing again. Stay if you still feel called." Her eyes lingered on the word. Called, not hired. Called. She looked up. Richard's voice was quiet. "You didn't come to save us, I know that. But God used you anyway." She swallowed hard. "I didn't come to stay." He nodded. "But maybe staying is obedience now." They didn't need to say more. Some answers don't arrive as sentences. Only peace. Later that night, Richard sat on the edge of the boys' bed, reading from Claire's old storybook. Both boys had fallen asleep mid-chapter, heads resting on his arms. He didn't move. The red kite sat folded near the window. The wind outside had stilled, but in his heart, something was just beginning to lift. He kissed each boy on the forehead, and before he turned out the light, he looked toward the ceiling, eyes wet, but smiling. "I'm learning, Claire," he whispered. "I'm still learning." The house didn't look different. The marble floors still gleamed. The grand staircase still curved like a sculpture carved into silence. But something had shifted. You could feel it. In the way the walls no longer echoed with emptiness. In the way laughter no longer felt like a stranger. In the way the front door no longer felt like a finish line, but a welcome. Stella stood at the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled, rinsing blueberries for breakfast. No apron, no uniform, just comfort woven into the rhythm of morning. A cartoon hummed quietly from the living room where the twins sat shoulder to shoulder, building a fort from cushions and giggles. From time to time, one of them would glance toward the kitchen, just to make sure she was still there. She always was. Upstairs, Richard stood in what used to be Claire's reading room. Now it was something new. The walls were painted soft yellow, bookshelves lined the corners, a piano by the window, crayon art taped to one wall like stained glass. They called it Claire's Corner. Not as a shrine, but as a beginning. A room for memory, yes, but also for music, and mess, and presence. He pressed his palm against the doorway for a moment, then turned, walked down the stairs, and into the life he once kept at arm's length. That afternoon, a new rhythm unfolded. Lunch was loud, napkins unfolded, jokes told. Freddie spilled water across the table, and no one flinched. Oliver sang the wrong words to a song, and everyone laughed until they cried, even Richard. He had started to laugh again, not like a man escaping grief, but like someone who had finally made room for both joy and loss at the same table. After the dishes were cleared, he sat with Stella in the sunroom. The boys were outside with chalk, drawing suns and rockets and messy stick figures that always included her. He handed her an envelope, thicker than the last one. Inside, legal papers. At the bottom, his signature, and a line added in pen. In the event of anything unforeseen, Stella Gray is to be the children's legal guardian. She looked up at him, speechless. He didn't explain, just said quietly, "You became their safe place. Not because you were assigned, because you stayed." Her throat tightened. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more certain of anything I didn't plan." That night, the boys asked her to read the bedtime story from her chair, the one beside their bunk beds. It was a story about home, about a house that stood through every kind of weather because someone inside always kept the light on. They were asleep before she reached the last page, but she read it to the end anyway. Then she sat in the silence for a moment, watching their chests rise and fall, and she whispered, "Thank you, God, for trusting me with them." Downstairs, Richard stood at the fireplace, in his hands the last of Claire's journals. He didn't read it. He just held it, then placed it gently beside the family photo on the mantel, the one he'd finally put back. Stella's coat hung near the door now, her keys in the dish, her voice woven into the fabric of the home. He didn't know when the shift happened. He only knew that healing hadn't come like thunder. It had come in quiet, obedient steps. The next morning, the four of them walked to the hill behind the house. Freddie held the kite string. Oliver carried the tail. Stella walked beside them, one hand on Richard's arm. The wind lifted just as they reached the top. The kite rose easily this time. No stumbling, no hesitation. And the boys ran together, not away from grief but towards something lighter. Richard stood back, watching them soar, then turned to Stella. "Do you regret not going back to teaching?" She smiled. "No, I just changed classrooms." He nodded. "And me?" Her voice was soft. "You didn't need a teacher. You needed someone to remind you that grief doesn't get the last word." He looked out over the hill. The kite arced higher. The boys' laughter rang out, filling the air like music. He reached into his pocket, pulled out Claire's last letter, creased from being read too many times. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Later, as the sun sank low and the sky burned soft orange, the four of them lay on a blanket watching the clouds shift like stories. Freddie rested against Stella's side. Oliver tucked into his father's chest. No words were spoken. There was no need. The silence wasn't cold anymore. It was full, whole, and somewhere in the stillness it felt like Claire was smiling, not from the past, but from right there with them, in the wind, the laughter, the healing, and in the family they chose to become.